To begin with, let me introduce myself. My name is Or Rose, and I'm an Associate Dean at the Rabbinical School of Hebrew College in Boston. It's one of the newest rabbinical schools in the country. It is by design a pluralistic institution where Jewish students from a variety of backgrounds, religious, political, ideological, come together in preparation for the rabbinate. I also have the good fortune of being a faculty member at Hebrew College, which is situated next door to Andover Newton Theological School, one of the oldest Protestant seminaries in the country. And over the last several years, we have been able to develop together a rather robust interfaith initiative, which is now called CIRCLE, which stands for the Center for Interreligious and Communal Leadership Education. And in that context, I've had so many wonderful opportunities to engage in dialogue, study, and action with members of both communities. In thinking about the topic for today and reflecting on that wonderful experience a few months ago, I wanted to say a few things by way of introduction and then listen carefully to my dialogue partners. The first thing to say is that as meaning-seeking creatures, we are all involved in the creation and editing of stories. And we are doing that constantly, both internally and externally. And we do so, of course, because we are seeking a sense of orientation and purpose, existentially, morally, and spiritually. One of the great contemporary philosophers, Paul Ricoeur, wrote the following, which I think is an apt description of this art of storytelling. Life is an activity and passion in search of a narrative. Let me read it again. Life is an activity and passion in search of a narrative. And in fact, when we think about the creation of personal narratives, we are actually living in a web of stories. Stories that are personal, that are interpersonal, that are communal, that are national. All of those together create this beautiful, intricate, and complicated web of relationship and stories. And as Ricoeur says, quite brilliantly, I think, in all narratives, and Garfield made mention of this, there's both permanence and change, what he calls concordance and discordance. And that to me is an essential part of this narrative enterprise in general, but specifically as we think about doing this in an interfaith context. I want to also say that for me this is an interesting time to be involved in this discussion because in a week's time, in Jewish homes and synagogues around the world, people will celebrate the master narrative, if you will, the great story of the emergence of the people of Israel. That, of course, is the Exodus story, which is told and retold year after year in this great kind of ritual enactment. And we sit symposium style around our dining room tables and discuss issues of liberation and oppression, of death and rebirth. All of it is a kind of grand and intricate ritual, an embodied experience through foods and symbols and the like that help to create a lively story. And of course, as we know, for any kind of ritual experience, particularly when it's centered in the home, sometimes the most powerful stories are about grandmothers and grandsons baking honey cake and not necessarily about the ancient Egyptian taskmasters and the Israelites and the firing of matzah as the Hebrews hurriedly tried to leave Egypt. So on the one hand, there is this great narrative of our people that we tell. On the other hand, of course, we also need to think about our own life stories as sacred narratives. We have to at once honor the legacies that are larger than ourselves, the stories that preceded us and that we are a part of, and also think about the construction of sacred narratives as our lives unfold. On the one hand, we don't want to be solipsistic. We don't want to simply celebrate the I as the measure of all things. On the other hand, I think that unless we are intentional in telling, retelling those stories of our highs and our lows, of our searches and our losses, then we impoverish the religious or spiritual search. And there was a great Hasidic master who died in the turn of the last century named the Sfat Emet. And he asked the following question: why is it that the book of Genesis is dominated by stories about people? After all, God could have chosen to begin with the story of the creation of the universe, of cosmogenesis, and then turn to the giving of the Torah. After all, that seems to be at the heart of the entire enterprise. Why not begin with creation and then turn to Torah and mitzvot? And his answer to that question is that the reason we dwell for so long in the lush narratives of Genesis, both about the virtuous acts of our forebears, but also dealing with their foibles quite openly, is because they present us with models of spiritual search. But also, he says very importantly, it's not only that we seek to learn from them based on the content of those stories, but the very placement of those stories in the book of Genesis reminds us that we must be attentive to our own sacred stories. That the lives that we are living can be instrumental in the ongoing chain of tradition, and that perhaps one day our narratives will be touchstones like the Bible and all of the commentaries that follow for people that follow in our footsteps. So with that, I want to turn things over to Samir, my dear friend and colleague, and then hopefully we could come back to the ways in which this work can actually be implemented, some of the experiments that we've all engaged with in various